You cannot fight irrationality with logic. You are putting me on trial for your own racism. They want us to agree that these people deserve to die, that these people are these kind of like freaks of nature that exist in our nation. And you have to shed these kinds of affiliations in order to be deemed worthy. And these affiliations are, determined largely by the West. It says so much about the nature of the native versus the nature of the settler, the psyche of the native versus the psyche of the settler. They have not been able to occupy your perception of yourself.
Welcome to the Big Picture podcast. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today I sit down with Palestinian writer and journalist and poet Mohammed el-Kurd. Mohammed, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So you are a celebrated and published poet. Your 2021 debut poetry collection, Rifqa, received wide acclaim, and your new book, Perfect Victims in the Politics of Appeal, is going to be published January 2025. Is that correct?
Hopefully. Depending on what the lawyer says. We can publish it.
Let's see. Hopefully you're putting up a good fight.
Yeah.
You are also a cultural editor at Mondoweiss and a columnist at The Nation.
Yeah.
And on your organizing side, you really kind of were thrust into the spotlight back in 2021 during the Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign, when you were campaigning to essentially try and save the neighborhood that you grew up in Jerusalem. Let's start there. Let's start with what that period of your life was like, when all of a sudden you might have gone from being a resident of a neighborhood that was under threat to suddenly being a resident of a neighborhood that was under threat with the entire world watching. What was going on there?
I think what's unique about our neighborhood isn't precisely the dispossession, but the kind of attention that the dispossession received. And many will say, it's because we put up a good fight, or we ran a good media campaign, which is partially true, but also because we are a neighborhood that, despite being established as a refugee housing project, we are still a neighborhood that's relatively nice, and it's surrounded by all of these foreign embassies. So you have all of these diplomats who work in the neighborhood and rent in the neighborhood, drink coffee, and then they smell the tear gas, and then it becomes a problem, I think. But in terms of people getting thrown out of their homes, it's the everyday battle that so many Palestinians fight, and not many of them receive the kind of attention we received. It started for us in 2009, actually. So we don't need to go into the whole history of it, but since the 70s, there has been U.S. registered settler organizations that are, tax exempt here, that have been trying to get us out of our homes with falsified documents, using the kind of leverage they are given through the Israeli government and through the Israeli judiciary, which is, a judiciary built by and for settlers. In 2009, we had the first kind of wave of forced expulsions, and half of our house was taken over by settlers, and also 3 other families in our neighborhood lost their homes completely to settlers. And then there was also a similar campaign. It was very publicized. Jimmy Carter decided to come, but only after he wasn't president. So as useful as you think that was. And then in 2022, I got a call from my dad, and he was like, this is happening again. And I was just like, I don't know what to tell you. And he was like, we have to do something about it. And there was a collective mass effort from so many young people in our neighborhood and in the surrounding cities that have kind of emerged as a Save Sheikh Jarrah campaign to try to bring media attention onto the issue. And we had our small victories in the sense that we were able to stop the forced expulsions. And I think our ability through through this kind of mass mobilization to stop the expulsions proved, without dispute, that this was not a legal issue or a real estate dispute, as the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs likes to put it, but rather a political issue, an issue of settler colonialism. I think that was the biggest victory of all, is the ability to use our neighborhood as a microcosm through which people can understand the Palestinian condition. But still, the fight, continues, and not only do our homes hang in the balance because they still have many procedures to go through before they can decide that we can stay in our homes for good, and knowing that the judge himself is a settler, that's very unlikely. But also beyond our neighborhood, there's many, many, many neighborhoods in Jerusalem, in Masafir Yatta, all over. And actually, it sounds so silly even talking about dispossession when I'm recognizing now as I say it that there's been neighborhoods that have been completely destroyed by airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, in the south of Lebanon, in parts of Beirut, that there have been families that have been wiped from the registry, complete families erased from the public registry. So not to give into a hierarchy of oppression, but it feels almost silly to talk about we're going to get evicted or we're going to get forcibly expelled.
Right, because of how imminent and how urgent the situation is in Gaza, in South Lebanon at the moment. One of the things when the times that I've been to Jerusalem, the thing that always stays with me is that there are different aspects, different layers to occupation and the way that occupation plays out. And I'm Egyptian. I grew up in an Arab-speaking household with Al Jazeera on in the background. So you get used to a certain image of what the Palestinian struggle looks like. And oftentimes it is either what we are seeing in Gaza, and never to the extent that it is now, or what we see in the West Bank, the confrontations with soldiers, the tanks, the IDF, the military side of the oppression. And what being in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah, and watching what was happening in 2021 exposes is that there is this whole other aspect of occupation that is a lot more insidious. It's a lot harder to name. It's the bureaucratic side of the occupation. And did it feel like in that moment of time that there was starting to become a language that you could use, that people could listen to and could identify with?
Yeah, you say insidious, which I think is a more appropriate word to describe it, but I've always referred to it as absurd or comical, because it is quite insidious, but it's also quite hard to imagine. And it's stranger than fiction to say I grew up in a home, and one time this guy with a Brooklyn accent, actually he's from Long Island, came over, knocked on our door, said, I'm your landlord and I'm going to evict you. Never met the man. And then you have a guy from Long Island living in your house. It's absurd. And then you grow
probably
up
the most infamous person from Long Island now. Yeah, they need to do better. Yeah.
The kind of exporting they're doing. I think he was fleeing fraud charges, but who cares? Yeah, you have you grow up with busloads of these American Jewish tourists walking into our house, walking into our home, into our garden as if it's some kind of zoo, and gesturing at our homes and singing and so on. But then when you're looking at the news, you read about evictions, and that does not to say that evictions cannot be extremely violent, but you read about evictions. And that does not ring the bells of a complicit judiciary, a decades-long, a centuries-long project of settler colonialism. It does not ring the bell of shady tax-exempt charities in the United States. It doesn't aptly describe it. And so when we stopped using the language of eviction and we started using the language of expulsion, I think that allowed the listener a clearer image of what's happening. And the description matched the images they were seeing. And this is why I think, when people say we fixate too much about language, this is why I think it's so important, because people are seeing those images of people being blown to bits to Gaza, and people are seeing, the videos. But the way these things are described, they obfuscate the truth of what's happening, that this is a genocidal campaign. And I think this is where I believe it's important to focus on language. Not saying that, sentences are airstrikes, but, supplementary.
But then there has also been this conversation about headlines specifically.
Yeah.
And, somebody who has been a journalist for more than a decade and a half now, It's always weird to me because I understand how that headlines aren't necessarily written by the reporter that writes the story, but that there is so much power in what a headline conveys. And this conversation around passive language and active language, and when you say that an Israeli airstrike killed someone, or when you say that somebody died in an explosion or an airstrike, and that there is also an understanding that matters, and that translates into a kind of erasure of violence that is happening. And so it is interesting because as you're right, there is the immediacy of what is happening. There is the immediate violence. There is the immediate death and loss of life. And there's also this language that, because we're not there on the ground and we're removed through a barrier of social media or through a barrier of a news report, the language becomes kind of the vessel that we are able to understand what's happening.
100%. And it gives you, I think language gives you your belief in a way. If you're, this is not to insult readers of the news, but, most people don't read beyond the headline. The really nice ones will scroll to the second paragraph. But yeah, a lot of the times people do not have critical readership, and they look in the headline for their belief. They look in the headline to confirm their belief, but also to formulate their opinion. And, sometimes you have the kind of indulgence in passive voice, but oftentimes you have these very strange ways to describe events. For example, when Shirin Abu Akleh was assassinated by the Israelis in Jenin, the headline for the New York Times was a trailblazing Palestinian journalist dies at 51. So it's not even that
it's an obituary.
Killed. It's not even. There's not even we're naming that she's been assassinated. We're not naming the culprit. Mm-hmm. It's not even we're saying the health ministry says none of that. It's just she died.
Yeah.
And it's absurd. But I also think it's a bit dangerous to try to kind of change the fabric of these institutions. Try to it's a dangerous game for two reasons. One, I think it's a bit undignifying to push this, or institutions that have told us that it's in their DNA to dehumanize us, to push them to do better, quote unquote. But it's also, I think it's a much better fight to dismantle and destroy their prestige, their credibility in people's minds, and simultaneously uplift the institutions and the media initiatives that better represent the truth. I almost said represent us, but it's not. I'm not really interested in being represented. I want the facts to be represented. And, oftentimes this becomes an issue of representation. Is this, what's, what good is the New York Times if there is no Palestinians in the newsroom? But I wonder what's good are these Palestinians in the newsroom if the standards of the New York Times insist on erasing us,
And you've seen that happening, and there's so many stories of people that are in these newsrooms, whether it's the New York Times or CNN or a myriad other institutions, where they have fought to get in there. And they have fought to try and be able to represent their communities. I mean, I got into journalism because I felt that Muslims were vastly underrepresented, and that being in these newsrooms would allow me to at least have a presence that otherwise would not exist. That there wouldn't be anybody in these newsrooms questioning these stories. And yet more and more we are seeing examples of people in these newsrooms being silenced and being ostracized and pushed aside, and being told that, you're too close to a story, you can't be trusted, you are too biased, you are too emotionally engaged. And it is wild to me because this isn't, there are so many people that are on the other side of that conversation, where either people that have served in the IDF or people that have ties to the Israeli government.
Their kids are in the IDF, and then they're writing stories about Palestine.
And that question isn't asked. That those people aren't being accused of not being objective or being too close to a story. it makes me think about what the purpose of these institutions are. Because obviously, it's a big deal when an institution as big as the New York Times publishes a story. It adds a certain weight. It gives it a certain sense of legitimacy and a platform. But at the same time, when you were having to continuously fight the language that is being used, even if these stories are being told, and these stories are being told, there's constantly a tremendous amount of work and good journalism that happens at these institutions, but the impression that it gives, the headlines, the way that the language is being carefully selected, that is a form of erasure, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think you're absolutely right to say that there's like this double standard in which we are demanded a neutral stance, whereas Americans, Israelis, Europeans can be in cahoots with the military or with the government. Like somebody like the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic can go volunteer to be a jailer, basically, join the Israeli army, and then run a publication and assume this neutral position or this objective position. It's absolute nonsense. But at the same time, I think I just want to demand. I don't mind, to be honest, them being able to have their opinions or have their ties or whatever. I want transparency, and I want the same kind of standard extended to me, because I have my own biases and I have my own affiliations, and I don't think that disqualifies you as a journalist. I think the industry has evolved, far beyond that in some regards. There is this Egyptian proverb, maybe I'm making it up because I heard it on Instagram, but there's an Egyptian proverb that I think about when I'm thinking about the New York Times, and it's "Nifsi fi wa tfu alayh," which is like, I crave it, I desire it, but I spit at it at the same time.
Yeah.
I think ultimately this gets to the heart of this issue, and right now we are demanding a boycott of the New York Times, and certainly there are good people that work there, and certainly there are instances, a broken clock, in which they can deliver good stories. But I find it strange to be simultaneously accusing these institutions of bias, of discrimination against Palestinians, accusing them of erasure, of dehumanization, of racist headlines, of racist editorial policies, and then at the same time also continue to seek their validation, continue to seek them to platform you. It's command, yani. It's like you're like playing for both teams, and it's strange, particularly as you recognize that the Times and so many other organizations are in a lot of ways recognizing the pressure that is being exerted onto them ever since the start of the genocide, and they are in some ways, however implicitly, are trying to do some damage control or are trying to correct their image. And when you recognize this, this is why they're running some kind of quote-unquote positive stories, despite the editorial problems with them, you also recognize yourself as a Palestinian or as an Arab contributing to these institutions as a currency. You recognize not only, are they legitimizing or like giving exposure to your story or to your piece of writing, but also by offering your likeness to these organizations, you are giving them legitimacy, and they desperately need it in this particular moment where opinion, I believe, of these mainstream media institutions is not the best.
So let me ask you then, because you're somebody that has been profiled, interviewed by a lot of these big institutions, and a lot of these institutions are also the ones that you and others will blame for everything that we're talking about right now. This double standard, this eraser of identity. How do you acknowledge that complexity? What does it mean when you are preparing for an interview with CNN, but you also understand what CNN is doing?
I think the tension is there. I think this is a really good question. I just want to say that I've never been profiled by any of them. Just saying. I heard that somebody was trying to pitch a profile to the Times, but they rejected it, and I would have also said no.
Right.
But I've never been profiled.
Well, if you got the offer,
I would have said no. But
if someone from the New York Times listened to this and then,
I don't think I would. I think I would be crossing a picket line. But like part of me would love to read like a very, hateful profile of me because I thrive on that.
Takedown piece. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love that so much actually. Obviously.
We could do one if you like. If that's
please do it.
Yeah.
Can we change the trajectory of this podcast? But yeah, the tension I think is recognizing that you are talking to the audience. You're not talking to the interviewer. I think there's a difference here between me coming to your podcast and I'm like engaging with you in good faith. I recognize that you engage with me in good faith. You're like trying to complicate the conversation versus when I'm on national television, I have no interest in changing Anderson Cooper's mind because whatever I tell him is never going to be as good as that paycheck, But I recognize that there are people either eager or curious or sympathetic or on the fence or people who are hateful or propagandize who I can address directly with simple language, with inviting language. I can put them in my shoes. And this is the kind of utility of these big interviews, especially because you recognize in the pre-interview, you have the pre-interview. Before they ask you a bunch of questions, you give them a bunch of bullshit answers, and you recognize, okay, they're interested in humanitarian story, they're interested in knowing about you as an individual, and you go on there and you try as hard as you can to make it a collective story, to say the political things they're refusing to say, and also there's that. I have to admit that there's also a spectacle that I think a lot of people are hesitant to admit, but I think there is like when. And I've never been invited to the same network twice, but when I go on these, interviews, I'll do the pre-interview and I'll, kind of say whatever I need to say to confirm that the interview will be live and we're good to do it. And then on the interview, I am looking for ways to flip the script to challenge the power dynamic. Because my interest, again, is not convincing Jake Tapper of his own biases. My instinct is to dismantle the kind of prestige he holds in people's minds. And people are entertained because also these television networks are entertainment companies. And it's literally in the fine print that they're entertainment companies. And people are looking for these moments of, it's kind of vulgar to say that it's like entertainment. But sometimes the television is not so much about what you're saying. It's about, are you able to challenge the power dynamic, which renders this news company, doctrine for news watchers. And I think, that is the merit. But also if there's like a call to boycott, then I would respect the call to boycott.
That spectacle thing is really interesting because, I think you're absolutely right. And it's one of the really bizarre things about a news outlet that might not give space and time for Palestinian voices, but will repeatedly share an interview clip that is going viral, for example, even if it's someone such as yourself ripping into an anchor at CNN. But because it's going viral, then they understand that they need to share it and that there's a currency in that.
Yes. There's a market.
There's a market. And I think I can't think of a better example of that than Piers Morgan.
Yeah.
And that has been surreal to watch.
Yeah.
This show that has almost completely dedicated itself to talking about Israel and Palestine and bringing on voices that increasingly, there's been some really great voices that have been on there, but increasingly it's become a platform that seems to just want to go viral. And that it's found a formula and understands that people are invested in this issue and it wants to milk it as much as possible. How does that feel? How does the spectacle aspect of it? Yeah,
I said this word earlier. I think I was saying what I was saying, I was thinking about Piers Morgan as well. Yeah. When I said the word earlier, vulgar, and I think this is part of like why I kind of stopped doing a lot of television interviews, because it felt like, at first, at first I took pride in, like, I am playing mind games on this network that will never invite me again, and I am taking advantage of their platform to deliver a message. But then when everything started happening in the Gaza Strip, they recognized that there's an eagerness from people, and they recognize that they're also under pressure to appear balanced. But it became a bit of a gimmick, like the first time Piers Morgan emailed me to go on his show, I said verbatim, I'd rather claw my eyes out. And every 3 weeks, he'll message me again, asking me to go on his show. And I recognize that he has nothing, he is not interested in what I have to say. He is not interested in my participation. He has no interest in challenging his views or the views of his viewers. It's about creating this circus act in which there's a bunch of talking heads yelling at each other, and we are sitting at home being like, oh, you really gave it to him, or oh, whatever. And both parties are kind of appeased because both parties end up getting this really snappy soundbite. And don't get me wrong, there is a value. There is a value in it, in terms of radicalization value, propaganda value. There is a value in these kind of simple sound bites and how they travel. But you should always self-reflect and ask myself, is what I'm doing purely entertainment, or am I using entertainment as a means to an end, or am I using this kind of spectacle as a means to an end? And I personally, I could be 100% wrong. And this is not, to spite anyone doing anything. But I personally felt during the war on Gaza that we were, and obviously it's ongoing, but I felt there was, I always used to push back about this idea that images speak 1,000 words, but there were certain instances where, the footage spoke for itself. Mm-hmm. And it felt almost profane to go and debate it. Mm. And I think that's the issue I have with the likes of Piers Morgan, is the idea that the slaughtering of people, broadcast in real time, is this debatable topic. And I come in with my talking points and you come in with your talking points, and we fight it out this is some kind of college course.
And because also inherent in that is an assumption that there are two sides to everything.
Yeah.
And that, yes, this is horrific, but there's going to be a counter argument that's just as valid and needs just as much space to be heard.
Yeah. The departure point is flawed. We're not departing from the discussion does not begin with this is a genocide. Here are differing opinions about it. The departure point is you are the viewer watching people being burnt alive, incinerated. You are watching real-time footage of prisoners being raped by Israeli soldiers. You're seeing Israeli soldiers riot in the street, demanding their right to rape Palestinian prisoners. You're seeing parliamentarians boast about how righteous it is. You're seeing these absolutely crazy things, and I'm going to invite you as my host to talk about somebody else who rejects the evidence of their eyes and ears and doesn't believe this is happening, And a lot of the time, the person and I don't do debates, to be honest, but a lot of the times the person on the opposite end of the debate, you can tell if you have any kind of knowledge about the way people debate, you can tell that the person is actually not always being just insidious. I think they are, but at the same time, I think they are also suffering a serious kind of, the word for it, I can't really say, I don't know how to say it in English, I've only ever read it. It's incredulity or something.
Incredulity.
Yeah, there's something going on there where they're actually, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to sympathize with them, but you recognize the person across from you is not rational. This is not to say that Israeli officials are not trained in these kind of half-truths and pretenses and lying and deception, whatever. But a lot of the times, the people, when you see these Jewish college kids who live in high-rise apartments, whose parents pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to send them to these Ivy Leagues, crying in Congress and in the Senate, feeling that they feel for their life. Of course, it is crocodile tears, 100%. But at the same time, these crocodile tears, there's something more profound there. And I'm, again, not trying to make an excuse, but you recognize when you cannot fight ridiculousness. You cannot fight irrationality with logic. I can't debate you out of paranoia, I have to let you know that your paranoia is simply unacceptable to me, that it's simply irrational. And I think that's the better approach, or at least the approach I've adopted.
That makes me think as well of some of the reporting that we've seen recently about with Israeli soldiers, whether it's people dealing with PTSD or trauma as a result of their deployment in Gaza, but also when it comes to that conversation around public safety and where people feel threatened by, this happens in the UK a lot, and there's been a big conversation around whether protests make people unsafe. And it's, on one hand, you can kind of recognize the absurdity of it, as you said. On another hand, it almost feels like the conversations are framed to prioritize emotion over anything else. And I feel like I'm setting you up a little bit, but how do you address that? How do you deal with this conversation that tells you, yes, but this person feels unsafe?
They should go to therapy. I don't know. They take a Xanax. They can try meditation. It's not my. I just don't think we have any room for it whatsoever. Because one, it is by design a red herring. Like, it is by design, whether these kids intended or not. But like the way, and I know how these workshops, like the Zionist propaganda workshops go. I know like the global language manual that they published in 2009. Like, there's a lot of things that people could dig into, like Stand With Us, Canary Mission, like all of these things that offer them whatever. But let's say there's a person who's untainted by these kinds of like programmings and these kinds of like workshops or whatever. They're still like diverting critical scrutiny from the focal point, which is the fact that, your warplanes that are financed by British and German and American money have burned people alive in their tents while they're connected to IV drips on makeshift hospital beds. And I am asked to care about your stupid feelings. Whether these feelings are valid or not, it's not the priority. And I will also raise another, maybe less important, but I think it's been getting under my skin, is that we endure, as Palestinians, as Arabs, as allies of the Palestinian cause, we endure an insane amount of vitriol, of verbal abuse, be it online or in person, an absurd amount of defamation, an absurd amount of libel. And for long I've never mentioned it, never talked about it, because I think it's obviously secondary, if not irrelevant, to the actual bombings and killings and genocide. But I think it's important to note that if we are in our discourse scary or threatening, this is a two-way street. But the only feelings who are prioritized are Jewish feelings or are Zionist feelings. And you seldom see anyone addressing, anti-Palestinian racism as much as they address anti-Semitism. Let's say, like, if there is anti-Semitism in our movement, you never see someone addressing misogyny, if there is misogyny in our movement, as much as they address anti-Semitism. And so you wonder, is this an issue of principle, right? Or is this something else? And the something else could be two things or more. But one, the person is being strategic, where they recognize that Jewish lives are worth more than our lives, and their feelings matter more than the burning of our children. And thus it is strategic to distance myself from this like supposed anti-Semitism, right? The other thing is you recognize, no, actually there is this concerted effort to delegitimize our movements by slapping them and labeling them as anti-Semitic or whatever. And I've been eager to hear someone say, you know, and I'll say it myself, but I've been eager to hear someone say, we so often try to dispel this kind of connection between us and anti-Semitism. And, you know, we have done it for decades. And I can argue to you right now coherently how anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? But, you know, why doesn't anyone ever say, even if there are these kinds of animosities, there are these kinds of like feelings of disdain that exist, do they really compare to a nuclear power wiping family after family from the public registry, of burning people, of bombing them to shreds? Why are we giving so much heft and so much screen time to talk about someone's feelings when there is whether they're my feelings or you know, the Zionist students' feelings, when there are people being killed? And we say these things. We say there's 40,000. Other people say, I hope it's 40,000. Other people say it's 200,000, you know. But we say these things and we don't really contend with what they mean. The other day I burnt my finger on the stove, and I just kind of like zoned out for a few minutes thinking about the fact that there are people who were burned, you know, in their final moments, or crushed under rubble. And we say these things, we say them so blasé almost, we say them to prove a point, like 40,000. And we don't consider that each one of these killings, each one of these martyrdoms was, I hope not, but was devastatingly painful. And yet we are asked to dedicate our time and energy trying to talk about some students' feelings. You know, I don't care. I don't care.
What I'm hearing you saying is this idea, and I'm really glad that you brought up this, the anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiments that, I mean, all of us have had to deal with our entire lives, and that oftentimes feels like it's being used as a way to silence people when they do speak out. Even we see it happening in interviews. We saw it happen with that interview with Mustafa Barghouti when I think it was, Talk TV, which should not be used as an example of legitimate media, but when he was yelled at and said that, you know, you're not used to a woman speaking to you, and there's so much in that. There's so much that's going on in that, and this guy is like, I mean, it's sad to see somebody who is my father's age being spoken to like that. But it is the ways in which that language, which really reared its head in following October 7th, it came alive in a way that hadn't been true in years. That language is hard to overcome because it almost feels like by your very existence, there are these assumptions. There is an assumption that you are anti-Semitic. There's an assumption that you are a misogynist. There is an assumption that you are homophobic by your nature as an Arab, as a Muslim, as a brown person. And those things are there whether you acknowledge them or not. And so when you step into that space, these things are already in the air. Mm-hmm. And so when somebody invokes them, it almost feels like it's a trump card. How do you respond to these things that are often unsaid but are felt in those spaces?
And they're confirming the viewers, they're confirming the viewer's bias, right? Like it's like you said, it's a trump card. And also, you know, we did this event a few days ago, and I was making a lot of jokes, and you could almost feel sometimes there was a tension when I made jokes. Like people looked around to see if they could laugh before they laughed, and a lot of the times, like my friends will pull me aside. Well, you know, I think they recognize I'm a lost cause now, but in the beginning they would pull me aside and they'd say, like, you know, the audience is already so suspicious of you. Why would you, why would you why would you like make fun about things about taboos or like things that people hold as true? Like your role is to you know, like diffuse these tensions. And I think that's precisely true. And by laughing at them, by making fun of them, or not just satirizing, but also by being flippant or by rejecting the premise of the question, that's a better response than whatever else being like, you know, like people will say Palestinians are ignorant, and we will say we have the highest literacy rate in the Middle East. People will say we're oppressive, and we'll show them photos of like, you know, we'll show them photos of like we'll say, I don't know, like there's always this kind of rebuttal, and I almost think, you know, we're playing into their own hands, because I personally believe we could be a nation of misogynists, homophobes, terrible, stingy, smelly people, and we still do not deserve to be bombed. That's it. There is no moral or character test. You are not to put me in cross-examination to determine whether or not you can bomb me or kill me or wipe me from the earth. Certainly the Palestinian people are good people. Certainly we have a lot to be proud of. But it's irrelevant, because you are putting me on trial for your own racism. And I want to ridicule your own racism. And I'm rambling a bit, but I just want to say one more thing about this. Is, you know, like you said, this language is extremely hard to overcome, particularly because it normalizes this like anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim sentiment. But I almost appreciate it or prefer it to the more insidious or like the more underhanded things that we say in the media that not a lot of people interrogate.
Like what?
You know, recently Mahdi Hassan was on CNN.
Yeah.
You know, and someone said to him this like extremely racist thing about.
Said, I hope your beeper goes off.
Yes. Yeah, and you know, rightfully the panel erupted. But I think the flaw there, and no one should endure that kind of you know, language. But the flaw there was that guy said, "Oh, I thought you said you support Hamas," and Mahdi was like, "No, I support the Palestinians. I never said I support Hamas." And the implication here is, if someone supports Hamas, then they deserve death. You know, I heard this from Christian Amanpour. She asked an Israeli author, "Do you think that everybody deserves dignity and human rights, including the Palestinians?" And then she quickly was like, "And I'm not talking about Hamas." And there's this assumption that if you support or uphold a certain political belief or like a certain political affiliation, then you are legally, justifiably, mandatorily, you are condemned to die, as if that's a sound logic. And we just accept it. We tell people there is a prerequisite, a certain dispossession. You have to shed these kinds of affiliations in order to be deemed worthy. And these affiliations are, you know, determined largely by the West. And they're disproportionate. They're not. No one asks the same of people who support the Israeli occupation forces, despite their heinous crimes, you know? And here I think is that's a lot more hard to overcome, because unfortunately people do believe that you should be killed on the basis of your political affiliation, on the basis of your beliefs. This is why it was so ridiculous but also effective for the Israeli president to say, we found a copy of Mein Kampf in this room, and thus we need to annihilate these people. You know, and the instinct is to be like, well, you can find Mein Kampf anywhere. You don't know. The person may have been just curious and wanted to read history. You know, God forbid, men have hobbies. But the larger thing there is, I could have a Mein Kampf, I don't know, toy shop. You can't fucking bomb me for these things. That's a false premise. You know, I use the toy shop thing analogy because I do want to go to the extreme. Like, no matter what I do, what I say, you can't kill me on the basis of what I said. Not if you like uphold these so-called values of like free speech and شو اسمه, I don't know, free speech or human rights وهيك يعني. You can condemn me, you can be mad at me, you can be أبصر شو. I mean, I think there needs to be repercussions if you ever bought a Hillary Clinton book, but I don't think you should die per se,
Per se. I think that what you're describing is something that is still very difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess the clearest example of that is this idea, is this do you condemn Hamas question? And you have been asked it, and almost every single person that has spoken, certainly Palestinians, that has spoken on any kind of platform over the last year and before that, has been asked this question. And it is always tends to be the first question, the first hurdle that you have to overcome in order to be allowed to speak. And it makes me think about the fact that those frameworks are set out very clearly. The starting point is decided very clearly. This is what you have to do. This is what you have to prove to me in order to earn your right to be heard and to be listened to. And that is a very difficult thing. And I haven't really, there's been people that have had really brilliant responses to it, but I haven't heard anybody that has been able to remove that barrier entirely. Do you think that's possible? Do you think there's a way to be able to get rid of this framework and not have to kind of constantly be caught in this trap?
Hanan, if I'm not mistaken, but Hanan Ashrawi, like former member of the Palestinian Authority, and obviously we have our disagreements with the Palestinian Authority, she was asked this question, I think by the BBC, if I'm not mistaken, and she took the loudest, longest sigh possible, and she just lowered her head, and she was just and I think that even if she just stopped there, I think that's enough of an indication to the viewer. Because also, with that question, you're caught between a rock and a hard place, right? One is what you said, there's this kind of baseline that we both have to hold these shared beliefs in order for you to be deemed civil and worthy of engaging. But at the same time, the people asking these questions are not really interested. No one's asking you I'm interested in your nuanced opinion about Hamas, or what is your take about political Islam, or no one's actually interested in what I think of Hamas, right? It's like you said, I agree. They want us to agree that these people deserve to die, that these people are these kind of freaks of nature that exist in our nation. And you also, on the opposite end, especially in the UK and the United States, the material support laws are quite clear. And, so you're caught in this trap, So I think the affect here plays a bigger role than the substance of the answer, just kind of delegitimizing the question from the start helps the viewer. It becomes didactic to the viewer, or pedagogical to the educational. I don't need to use SAT words. Educational for the viewer, because they see okay, there's a faulty beginning. But yeah, I don't pretend it's an easy question to answer.
And one of the things that I feel like we've also been hearing over and over again is this idea, and specifically talking about Hamas, and you hear this from policy analysts, you hear this from the Israeli defense minister, this idea that you can never really defeat Hamas because Hamas is an idea, right?
Yeah.
And that you can't bomb an idea out of existence. And I find that really interesting. The framing of it, the phrase of it is really interesting because it makes it seem as if people in Gaza are dying for Hamas, for the idea of essentially a military and political institution. Whereas it feels like they are half right, but it's not Hamas that's not the idea.
Yeah,
right?
the idea is certainly not Hamas.
Is resistance.
Yeah, I think the phrase in Arabic it makes it's often attributed to Ghassan Kanafani, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was actually taken from a eulogy that somebody wrote for Ghassan Kanafani. Like someone said, Ghassan fikra wal fikra la tamut. He's an idea, and ideas do not die. And I think when people say this, they're not talking about Hamas or Hezbollah per se. They're talking about resistance. The idea that, and I would even, it's not just like people will say this is like a natural response. It's physics to me. It's like, it's basic physics, and like you have your boot on someone's neck, thus someone will struggle. And the idea is, as long as there is occupation, as long as there is oppression, as long as you continue to kill our siblings, as long as you continue to eat at our land, we will continue to resist. We will continue to struggle, right? This is the baseline. And it's 100% true, and it feels almost foolish that these politicians, these war hawks, think, and I doubt that they actually believe it, but think that they can eradicate this lineage of tradition that has emerged in the secular context in Palestine. It has emerged from leftists, it has emerged from political Islamists, it has emerged from Christians, it has emerged from all factions of society. It's not really, I mean, the people on the front lines today happen to be Islamists, and maybe their courage has something to do with their faith. But historically, many segments of our society and of every society have resisted. It's like it's a basic truth that people, as long as there's occupation, there will be resistance to it. And if I even want to reduce it and strip it of its politics, I will say that violence begets violence. It's as simple as that.
I think also I don't think anybody that has Palestinians in their lives, that has Palestinian friends, that knows Palestinians, can ever believe the idea that Palestinians will ever stop fighting for Palestine. Like it is something that is embedded in your DNA, and it is something that is passed from generation to generation. It is really spectacular to witness, to be able to, as an outsider, to be able to see. And when you think about the majority of Palestinians live and exist for generations outside of the land of Palestine, and yet you see kids that are 12 years old and they are so Palestinian and they have never set foot in the place where their grandparents comes from. That is powerful. That is a powerful thing. And so the last thing that I want to ask you is this idea of not only resistance but liberation, and I want to give you a space to hear what that idea means to you as a writer, as a Palestinian, as Mohammed al-Kurd.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually very interesting. I was thinking about this idea, and like I was joking with a friend that maybe there's like a genetic difference between us and our beloved enemies. Obviously, jokes. I don't believe in eugenics, but it's fascinating. That is true. Like, despite that, technically we are victims, and technically we don't have an ounce of their artillery. We don't have like a fifth of their weaponry. We don't have a fifth of their diplomatic reach. That we got arrested and people smile while they're getting arrested, or like people lose their loved ones and they say it's okay. We'll give birth to 10 more who will fight. People are subjected to so much violence constantly, and at the same time they have this mentality that they are invincible. Meanwhile, our occupiers, our colonizers are besieged, and they embody this besieged mentality. They believe that even in their high-rise apartments, that even with the nuclear power, that even with the ethno-national homeland, that they are still at risk, that they are still like 1 minute away from being wiped out. and it's extremely illuminating. It's illuminating. It says so much about the nature of the native versus the nature of the settler, the psyche of the native versus the psyche of the settler. The native is born and raised in so much violence that at some point they have nothing left to lose. This is not to undermine any kind of losses endured, but the most important thing is our dignity, right? And your ability to conjure up this dignity, to narrativize it in your mind, to create it for yourself, is to create these narratives that, these people are minuscule. I see this so much in Jerusalem, because it's still, every time I have to go to the Ben Gurion airport, it's still like kind of a visceral experience, because I can't believe they have an airport. It's just strange to me that like they're a country. It's just, I can't believe it, because in Jerusalem, like, yes, our houses get taken, and yes, our businesses are taxed exponentially higher rates, and yes, we endure like strip searches in the street, but there is this kind of collective consciousness in the street, in your family, and with your neighbors, that you think of the occupation almost as like a bureaucratic, irritant. It's not, they're just there, and they don't exist in your mind. They have not been able to like occupy your perception of yourself. And so despite their rifles, and despite their ability to put you behind shackles, and despite the violences they inflict on us is very real, still you are somehow, not everyone, but for many people, you're still somehow emancipated in the mind. Meanwhile, despite their vast power, they are, I think, an uncertain people, and just not very confident in their project or in their own ability to keep themselves safe, and that I think is powerful, and that's why people like cling on to this resistance. Now, in terms of liberation, I think it's a hard question again, because like the relentless bombardment and the relentless massacres almost like forces you to lower your ceiling. It forces you to say, you know what, just stop this. Just stop the starvation, and I'll take the crumbs. And so I think this is where it's important to look at the front lines and to look at the young people, young men who have nothing and are still refusing indignity as the human condition. And I don't know, we can talk a lot about what resistance means to me, but I think what liberation means to me. But I think fundamentally it's about not being afraid, and it's about not being afraid to laugh, and it's about not having a voice in your head that's constantly trying to get you to self-censor. This is very important to me. Obviously, we can talk about, destroying all the Israeli prisons, all the refugees returning, redistribution of resources. These are things that I think at this point are implied. But also there is so much psychic, damage that we have endured that we must unlearn.
Mohammed al-Kurd, I could speak to you about this for a long time, and I appreciate your insight and I appreciate your humor, most of all.
Thank you.
And I hope we get to speak again soon.
I appreciate you.
Rifqa is your poetry book, and your new book, what's it called?
Perfect Victims.
Perfect Victims.
Yes.
Look out for it in early 2025. Thank you to Mohammed al-Kurd for
Thank
joining
you so
us
much
today.
for having me. Appreciate it.
As always, we want to hear what you have to say. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to listen to this in an audio format, you can find it wherever you get your podcasts from. Until next time, I'm Mohammed Hassan. Salam.